This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired. Which one? Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another season of the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. I will be leading you through this season, and you know me, Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King. You hear me on all the other Detroit Sports Podcast Network. Well, specifically one, the Motor City Sports Rant, comes out on Tuesdays with John the Doc Macaroon, but we're not talking with him today. You're talking with me, and we're talking fantasy football. We're weeks away from week one, and I can't wait. I've talked numerous amounts of time that football is my favorite sport. I love fantasy football. Eventually, at some point in the season, I'm going to hate fantasy football, but that's just the nature of it, because with fantasy football, there's really high highs and really low lows. And especially last year, my first overall pick, Adrian Peterson, goes down in the first couple of weeks, and my season is shot at that point. And I know last year I talked that the previous season was one of the craziest seasons. I think this past year, the 2016 season, even crazier than that. You're looking at guys like Adrian Peterson, Todd Gurley, A.J. Green, and just a host of other players who did not perform up to expectations. Cam Newton, one of the top quarterbacks, Russell Wilson, both of those guys, they just didn't perform to where you thought they were going to go. I think they were going somewhere in the third, fourth round in a lot of drafts. And then you have a guy, a rookie in Dak Prescott, who comes out of nowhere and he's lights out. Is Dak Prescott going to be as good as he was this season? Is Cam Newton, Russell Wilson going to struggle again this season? It's probably going to be somewhere in the middle, and that's where I am here to help you try and figure out what's fact, what's fiction. So I have 2 leagues coming in, and we started the podcast last year around May, and this year I've been completely honest, totally busy. I've been at work, have a baby, if you've been listening to the other podcast. So with a 6-month-old and 2 jobs, I am a little bit behind the 8 ball in fantasy football. But have no worries. I've been looking at everything on the interwebs. I've been listening to other fantasy content, and I'm here to give you everything that you need to win your fantasy leagues again this year. So I'm going to start with some recent news in the NFL that's definitely going to affect you in drafts, because you're probably going to be starting your fantasy drafts in the next week or two, and I don't advise any of those leagues that draft in late July or really early August before preseason has even really started. We've only had 2 games at this point. There'll be a few more tonight, but we're only in the beginning of week 1 of the preseason, and we don't know what kind of injuries are going to happen, how positional battles are going to play out. So there's just so much you have to wait in the preseason that affects fantasy football. So if you can push back your drafts until at least week 3 in preseason, and after that you're kind of, if something happens between week 3 in the preseason and the beginning of week 1 of the regular season, it was just meant to be, and there's not much you can do. So I have 2 main, or actually I take that back. I have 3 main leagues. I have the Slackjaw League that I've been in with my brother. You've heard him on this podcast before. With Chris, you've heard him on the podcast before, and a whole bunch of friends. We've been doing this league, I think, for 17, 18 years at this point. And we got that. I have that league coming up. I have another family league that I do, again, with my brother and then a couple other people in the family. And we're finally adventuring into real professional fantasy football territory. I'm starting a league. It's going to be a dynasty league. And for anybody who doesn't know what dynasty leagues are, it means that you draft your team the first season, and then they carry over from year to year. So if you have a really, really good draft in year one, then you're going to be set for a couple years, hopefully. And if you draft bad, then you're going to have to really, really do your best and do your diligence to make your team better. You got to scour the waiver wire. You got to make trades. And the way that those leagues work, they don't have a draft every year, but they do have some sort of way where you get rookies on your team. The way that we're doing it, we'll have a rookie draft where we'll have like a 7-round draft where teams can draft the incoming rookies. I know some leagues will do just a straight up free agent period where you can sign those players and get those on rosters. But I'm really pumped for this league where we're going to do an auction draft to get the league started, and that even it adds a whole nother level of strategy to making your team. Because if we would have started this dynasty league with just your regular snake draft, with snake drafts, exactly where players are going to go. You know that the person who gets the first pick is going to get the best player in the draft. He's going to get the Ezekiel Elliott or Le'Veon Bells, and the number 10 pick is going to get the 2 turnaround picks there. But with an auction style draft, everybody has a chance at everybody. So if you really want to draft Le'Veon Bell, you can spend a ton of money, get him on your team, and he's going to be your workhorse in this dynasty league that you're going to see play out over a couple years. And conversely, if you do spend all that money, you're going to be filling out your roster with not so good talent. But that's how auctions work. It's strategy. It's trying to figure out how to fill your team up and how to financially structure that team. So I'm really pumped for that league. But yeah, let's get into some info that's going to affect your drafts. So right now, Jay Ajayi, Miami Dolphins running back, he's out with a concussion. And this is definitely something you're going to have to monitor throughout the preseason, because Jay Ajayi was a guy who he definitely opened up some eyes, turned some heads last year. I don't think people thought he was going to be the greatest initially. I think he actually got left home one game, but then he ended up having some really big days that probably helped a lot of people in fantasy football. So you're going to have to monitor him and see where he's going into the regular season. Sterling Shepard, New York Giants wide receiver, he's dealing with an ankle injury. And also, another person you're going to have to just continue to watch. Well, the same thing with concussions. Ankles are something that can linger. So it's something I would definitely keep in the back of your mind. If you are drafting a Sterling Shepard, know that even if he is fully healthy, he's going to be going into the year behind the 8 ball, because he's dealing ankle injuries. A small tweak can really change the entire change an entire season. So in Sterling Shepard, it could really have a really good breakout year this year. Ryan Tannehill, quarterback of the Miami Dolphins, probably wasn't on a ton of people's list. Maybe in 2 quarterbacks leagues, he's more likely to be owned. He might be a backup or a bye-week fill-in player for some people, but he's dealing with a leg injury, and he could even miss the entire season. So keep that in mind in drafting. And the Miami Dolphins went out and they signed recently retired, now unretired quarterback Jay Cutler, former of the Chicago Bears. He's had decent seasons in the past, but as of late, he's been a pretty awful quarterback and really irrelevant in fantasy football. But you do have to think that he's going to be paired up with Dolphins coach Adam Gase, who was Cutler's offensive coordinator in Chicago when Cutler had his best offensive year. So Cutler's going to be an interesting player because they have some interesting pieces down there in Miami with Jarvis Landry and Devontae Parker. So if Cutler can really come in, he already knows the offense, they might be able to do something. So Cutler might be an interesting late round backup quarterback for some people. DeMarco Murray from the running back for the Tennessee Titans, he's coming back from a hamstring injury, another type of injury where you're just going to have to monitor, wait to see what's going to happen with him, and if he can really bounce back. And DeMarco Murray is, I think, one of those players where you're going to want to handcuff him with the backup in Derrick Henry, because even last year, Derrick Henry coming in as a rookie, you figured that there was going to be a split there, and I think DeMarco Murray really. He definitely made himself the number one guy there, but the Tennessee Titans didn't spend a high draft pick on Derrick Henry just to keep him as a backup. So I think you'll probably see Henry get more touches this year, and if this hamstring injury is lingering at all this season, you're going to see Henry get more touches. So if you are a DeMarco owner, I would definitely consider spending a little bit higher of a draft pick on Derrick Henry, getting that handcuff, so that if DeMarco Murray, for whatever reason, he is out for a prolonged period of time, that you aren't, you're not scrambling to try and find some backup on the waiver wire to fill out your roster, because running backs is one of the most important positions in fantasy football. I'll talk about that at the end of the show, of why I'm leaning towards maybe going a little running back heavy this year, as opposed to wide receivers, which I was preaching last year. We'll get to that a little bit later. A last bit of news that I do want to point out is Devontae Freeman, running back from the Atlanta Falcons. He has had a stellar 2-season run. He's been very good. I think people might have thought he was going to slide a little bit last season, but he came back out, and the Atlanta Falcons offense was just on a roll last year. Him and Tevin Coleman really create a very good 1-2 punch, but I think Freeman is that main guy. And the news about him, though, is that he just signed a 5-year contract with a guaranteed $21 million. Now, this isn't injury news, but this is something you want to keep in your head, because time and time again, we've seen players get big contracts, and for whatever reason, whether it's they get hurt or maybe they just get a little lazy, they start to drop off a little bit once they get that guaranteed money. So this is the big contract for Devontae Freeman, and there is a viable running back behind him that if Freeman drops off at all, the Falcons aren't going to hesitate to bring in Tevin Coleman and let him carry the bulk of the load for that team, because this is a team that's coming off of a kind of a heartbreaking Super Bowl loss, and they're going to want to try and capitalize, try and get back to that promised land, and we're going to really see what's going to happen. So keep that in mind with drafting Devontae Freeman. I think you still have to draft him where he's listed. I think he's probably going in round 1 or early round 2. But just keep that in mind. That's something I know that happened to me back with Sean Alexander, all those years past, when he was just having crazy, ridiculous seasons. I think he came off like one of the best seasons in the history of football in touchdowns, and the following season got big money, and he fell apart, got injured, and was never really the same player ever again. So keep that in mind about Devontae Freeman. So in the coming weeks, I'll dive more into rankings and what players are going to be really good this season. But I really just want to start out this first episode of this season with players who are on different teams and how it's going to affect them and how they're going to be going into this season with those new franchises. So I think you really got to start with wide receiver Brandon Cooks, coming from a high-powered offense with the New Orleans Saints, now going to arguably the best team in the NFL with the New England Patriots. Now, immediately you would think that Brandon Cooks is going to be a perfect fit and that he's going to be Tom Brady's number one target. but you do have to have a little bit of reservation because Brandon Cooks, he really is a one-note type player. He's the guy that you send him on a fly route, you throw it deep, and then he catches it and gets, his stat lines look usually 3-4 receptions for 120, 130 yards and a touchdown or 2 touchdowns. He's not really that possession receiver, and I don't think his body can really hold up a full season being that possession type receiver, a guy going over the middle and just giving everything in his body to be that kind of player. He's not that type of player. I think he's still going to have a good season. We've seen some wide receivers come in and immediately fit in these situations, and Julian Edelman is definitely going to be that mainstay in New England. He's going to be the guy who does all the dirty work for Tom Brady. But Brandon Cooks, I don't think you're going to get the same kind of production that when Randy Moss came to the team and just had that ginormous season. I think you'll probably still get good production out of him. I see him as like a wide receiver 2. I don't think he's going to propel himself into the wide receiver 1. I'd have to see a lot more in preseason and be able to know that he's going to be playing all 16 games before I put him in that wide receiver 1 conversation. Next guy, a guy who actually left the New England Patriots, is LeGarrette Blount, the 30-year-old running back who's just a bruiser. He pounds down in the trenches, and he had a ton of touchdowns last year. Now he's on the Philadelphia Eagles, and it's gonna be interesting to see how he's gonna fit in that roster. They have Carson Wentz, and they're trying to really be a more passing team. And LeGarrette Blount definitely has he deserves a spot on an NFL team. How he's going to be used, I'm not sure if he's going to get a ton of yards, but where you're really going to see him is those touchdown vulture situations. When the Eagles get down to the red zone and get inside the 10-yard line, that's when you're going to see LeGarrette Blount come in, and he's going to rack up points. And there's going to be weeks where he gets a ton of points off touchdowns, and there's going to be weeks where he gets 0 to 2 points because they weren't in those types of situations and they didn't need to utilize them. The Eagles still have a host of running backs that they can put out there. I think Blount is probably going to be dependent on his touchdowns. So if you're in a league where you get tons of points for touchdowns, or if you're that deep and you have maybe like a Le'Veon Bell or an Ezekiel Elliott as your number 1 running back, you might be able to handle the point loss on those low weeks for LeGarrette Blount. And when he does break out and has like a 2 or 3 touchdown game, it's going to just propel your point total for that week. So Blount definitely still a really good option in fantasy football. I'd put him just because I think he's in a running back by committee still and going to be so dependent on the touchdown. I would put him as a low-end running back too, and maybe a guy you want to keep on your bench and play in certain weeks. Alshon Jeffrey, another guy who left his team to go to the Philadelphia Eagles. He's either really, really good or he's always hurt. So it's that question of trying to see what he's going to do. Is he going to be able to stay healthy an entire season? He's in a really good situation, coming from the Chicago Bears. Last year with Jay Cutler being hurt and the other host of quarterbacks that they trotted out there, wasn't in the best situation. He also was dealing with suspension. So I think coming to a team with a really young and up-and-coming quarterback like Carson Wentz, it's going to help Alshon Jeffrey, and I think he's going to immediately be the star, and I think he will become a favorite target of Carson Wentz. So I think Alshon Jeffrey, until he can really prove it, he's a wide receiver 2 to me. He will be drafted as a wide receiver 1 for a lot of players, and he might end up, just the way that the drafts turn, he'll probably end up being somebody's wide receiver 1 if they end up waiting on wide receivers. So be careful with Alshon Jeffrey, but if he can stay healthy, he should have a really good season. We seem to be talking about a bunch of Eagle players. So another former Eagle, Jeremy Maclin, started with the Eagles, was on the Kansas City Chiefs, started out red hot, and has just dropped off. And part of that is the system he's in. The Kansas City Chiefs were never really, they're not a passing team. They have Alex Smith, a guy who can accurately throw it about 10 yards. I may kid, he probably throws a lot better than me, but they're not a passing team. They've relied on Jamal Charles and Spencer Ware and all the other running backs that they'll hand off about 40, 50 times and throw it maybe 10 times. This is a team a couple years ago that didn't throw a touchdown to a wide receiver. So any situation that he's going into is going to be a better situation than the Kansas City Chiefs. And going to the Baltimore Ravens, he's in a really, really good situation with Joe Flacco, a big-armed guy, when he's even reunited with the offensive coordinator that he had when he was so good on the Philadelphia Eagles in Marty Mornhinweg in Baltimore. So it will, if he can stay healthy, which is a lot of these people, their biggest problem is staying on the field. So if Jeremy Maclin can stay on the field, and if he picks up this playbook really well, he's going to be a bright spot for fantasy teams. I put him as probably a mid to high wide receiver 2, similar to Alshon Jeffrey. He has the ability to be a wide receiver 1, but it's just, can he give that consistency that fantasy football players need from week to week? Because that's what it's all about. It's about maximizing the ability to score as many points each week. So he's a good player to have on your team. Not sure if he's going to be a starter every week. Another wide receiver who broke out last year, Terrell Pryor. He really came out of nowhere on the Cleveland Browns. I think he was buried on the Oakland Raiders when he came into the league. And, it was unsure, is he a quarterback? Is he a wide receiver? What's he going to do? And on the Browns last year, I don't think anybody really expected him to have the year that he had because he was going to be behind Corey Coleman. And the Browns just aren't that great of a team. They never are and probably never will be. But Pryor was a real big bright spot for the Browns last year, and he got paid, went to the Washington Redskins, now with a really good quarterback in Kirk Cousins, and it's going to be interesting to see what he can do. I do predict a little bit of a drop-off because people have a year of tape on him now at wide receiver, and it's gonna be some growing pains on a new team. Wide receiver is one of the toughest positions to transition from team to team, and if he doesn't have a connection with Kirk Cousins, then you're just not gonna see them really connect. But I think he's gonna get every chance to be the man there in Washington. So it'll be interesting to see how he does this season. Pierre Garçon, Washington Redskins wide receiver of last year. Now he's followed the former head coach, Kyle Shanahan, to San Francisco, and he's, there's nobody in San Francisco to catch balls. Torrey Smith is gone. Anquan Bolden hasn't been there for a couple years, and I don't see a lot happening for Pierre Garçon. Unfortunately, for the past couple years, I think people have expected more, but he's just not going to give you much. So Pierre Garçon is a backup wide receiver at this point, in my opinion, unless Blaine Gabbert can come out and become a world-class quarterback and, he really connects with Pierre Garçon. You're not going to get more than like a wide receiver 3 or one of those flex options on bye weeks. Or if you're in the game where you're playing the matchups week to week, you might have a good matchup one week with the 49ers. It's good. He's definitely had a tough schedule having to play the Seattle Seahawks and the Arizona Cardinals twice a year. But you never know. I'm not high on him, but as a late round flyer, maybe. And the last guy, who he wasn't on a team last year, but is on a new team, beast mode, Marshawn Lynch, coming out of retirement. He drove the golf cart all the way to Oakland. He's going to be playing for his hometown team, the Raiders. So he comes into a pretty good situation. Derek Carr coming off of that horrible leg injury, but I think he's going to be good for the beginning of the season. And the Raiders could be poised to make some moves this year in the NFL. They finally have a consistent running back. Latavius Murray was pretty good. He's gone now. I think beast mode, if he can come in and be productive, and which I think everyone is expecting him to be, he's going to be a really good addition with that team. So is he going to have one of the best seasons of his career? He's another year older. He's a year away from the game. It's hard to say. I think you're going to have to watch him in preseason if he does play and really judge for yourself if you think he can really do some damage on this team. I think from what everyone said, he's going to be good. And I don't think if there's any player in the NFL that you don't want to count out, I think Marshawn Lynch is that guy, because I think he has everything to prove, and he wants to take his team out on a high note. You know, Oakland, they're losing their football team. They're going to be going to Las Vegas. So he's going to want to get a championship for Oakland and for Raider Nation. So I think he's a high-end running back too, just because he's going to have that drive. He's fresh, and he's going to be great. So to end the podcast, I promised it in the Motor City Sports Rant to my draft strategy for you this year. Now, last year I told you want to load up on wide receivers because more often than not they are more consistent. And this year, I'm actually preaching the opposite. I think it goes back and forth. And this year, I think it's going to be you got to load up on running backs. And I'm not saying that the entire first 2 rounds has to be all running backs. I think that would be a dumb situation for any league because guys like Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham Jr., Julio Jones, they're going to score you tons of points. And to pass up those kinds of guys for the 7th or 8th rated running back is dumb. But what I'm talking about is in those middle to late rounds when if it's a toss-up between a running back and a wide receiver, if you have a proven running back there that has a solid path to whether they're a handcuff type running back or they're going to have a easier path to get you points. And if you're looking for somebody like a wide receiver to fill on bye weeks, there's going to be somebody out there on waiver wire because we've seen guys like Terrell Pryor who come out of nowhere and can actually do some stuff and help you out from free agency. So I think this year you're going to want to load up on running backs. If you've already got all your positions, you got your quarterback, you have your starting running backs, wide receivers, and maybe you looked at tight ends at that point. At that point, you're going to want to look at really finding those running backs that are going to help you in bye weeks or flex situations. That's going to do it for this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. I'll be back next week. We'll be through week 1 of the preseason. Hopefully nobody major is going to be hurt in these couple games. Knock on wood, everybody who already has their draft and has already drafted their team. Hopefully you don't have a guy like Ryan Tannehill or, somebody else. But anyways, that's going to do it for this. I'm Jason Jarvie. See you next week.